We've now come to an exciting part of the afternoon with our next session on the topic, Conversational AI, Making Human Interactions More Human. With increasing accuracy of conversational AI, viable applications of NLP have expanded exponentially. This session discusses how some of the most innovative applications of NLP, for example, voice, chatbots, are helping organizations connect and service their stakeholders, from employees to customers to partners at scale. Our speakers for the session are Dr. Lata Iyer, Head of Artificial Intelligence and Machine Learning, NatWest Group; Kayzad Hiramanek, Chief Operations and Customer Experience, Bajaj Allianz Life Insurance; and Raj Koneru, CEO, Kore.AI. The session will be chaired by Gopichand, Katragadda, founder and CEO, Myelin Foundry. When Gopi set out to create Myelin Foundry, he had a vision for using AI to transform human experiences and outcomes in wellness and in media and entertainment. Before that, he was the CTO and innovation head at Tata Sons, where he facilitated the development of pioneering products and services, collaboration, and innovation across the 100 billion Tata Group. Over to you, Gopi, to take this session forward.
Thank you, Justin, and it's wonderful being part of this panel. It's a topic of deep interest and futuristic view. So we're going to be talking about conversational AI. We're going to be talking about natural language processing. Maybe we'll talk about sentiment analysis. And joining me in this conversation are really people who have earned the stripes to be talking on the topic. We have Raj, who is from Kore.AI, is the founder of Kore.AI, Lata from NatWest, and she leads the AI and ML operations there, and Kayzad from Bajaj, Allianz, and amongst other things is leading the digital transformation of the organization across the board. So lovely having all of you on the conversation, and welcome. So we will talk about your backgrounds shortly. Just to set the stage, I would like to share some experiences which I have had related to the topic, conversational AI. The time goes back to 1998, and I'm sure some of you have been around then. I'm talking about a product called Via Voice, and this was a product from IBM. And at that point of time, it was touted to have 80% accuracy in voice recognition as you spoke into the computer. Of course, with my Indian accent, it fell far short of the 80%. I would guess it was about 60%. So pretty much not usable from an application standpoint for me. But also it's interesting that IBM and looking at voice recognition, the story goes back even earlier to 50 years before our times now. To 1970s, when they were looking at voice typing, and as they were experimenting with voice typing, they decided to see if it made sense if people would really warm up to the idea of voice typing. And they created what is called a prototype, and they had people come into a room and do voice dictation, and the computer screen would fill up with what they were talking about. And interestingly, why it was a prototype was there were a set of people behind who were actually listening and typing it in, just to see whether people were comfortable talking to a machine and whether people were comfortable talking when other people were also in the room, and whether they were comfortable talking when other people were also talking to the machine, right? So many complexities which exist even today. So what they found at that point of time was the consumer of such a service was not yet ready, but they still, I guess, went ahead and produced the product, and they were very early. And today we have many use cases that we use readily and on a daily basis, from users of the OTT space, and I myself am one. Very early, I've impressed friends using Fire Stick to pull up songs, of course, Hindi songs and spoken in a southern accent. Still, it was able to recognize and pull the songs, which was pretty impressive. Even in a noisy situation, it was doing okay. It dropped in performance, but it was still doing okay. And now even TV's remote have same features. So my LG OLED TV, for example, has the same feature of being able to converse with the TV and get some entertainment. Not to stop there, recently I've had the ability and from the team standpoint, and I was fortunate to contribute to the national security by using natural language processing on very small voice signals in heavy noise. This is because the signals get picked out outside the range of the transmitters, and to be able to do something like this is almost miraculous. Of course, the operators do it very well because they're detected, they are trained to detect such very small level voice signals in heavy noise. But even the machines do a fair job. And also been able to do, even with the Tata Group, Lata, and otherwise, we have done sentiment analysis on consumers. We have done sentiment analysis for OTT players, looking at conversations going on in various media which are open and available legally to look at for sentiments as it relates to corporations. So there are many more applications which all of you have been using in the financial space, in the insurance space, and Raj through his company has been enabling it across a slew of industries. So that's what we'll discuss today. And to set the ball rolling, I would invite each one of you to talk about how you have been using conversational AI in your businesses and in your careers, because it spans probably more than your current role. And your view of what are the challenges ahead. And that will help us have the conversation which will branch out into different areas. So Lata, we'll start with you.
Yeah. Now, thank you, Gopi. I think this is the best time we can talk on this topic. Obviously, the pandemic situation has actually put us into a situation where we really feel the conversation AI journey, which in fact in our NatWest we had been wanting to do from last 3-4 years, but for some prioritizations, right, this could not get through. Right? Getting our telephony data, getting chatbot data, and etc. were all done in isolated pieces. But then, these were actually done by third parties, right? And obviously the third parties, they had a limitation, right? So the categorizations of calls, what typically the customers are calling, what are the topics, etc., became very minimal because the whole categorization journey, right? The ontology was very limited to what was provided by the business then to the third parties. But during the pandemic situation, we realized that there were some hot topics, right? Like COVID, Corona, and mortgage delay, right? These were some things were never spoken about. And that is where exactly, as a bank, we wanted to intervene in those journeys and give a very high prioritization, right? Look at the vulnerable customers and ensure that whether the journey is taken care of. And that is when actually our group, our specialist group, AI CA practice group that I lead to, we thought like, forget about what the third party vendors look like. Let's start digging out all the kind of the conversations that customer talks on the telephony channel. Pretty much 50% of conversation happen through that, and the rest 50 happens through the self-service channels, the web chat, and as well as even the conversation virtual assistant. These are all actually isolated, right? But as a bank, right, whether you talk about retail or a commercial, the journey is not very uncommon, right? So customer could be still talking about ATM, a customer could still be talking about mortgage, but these could be retail, or this could be even commercial customers. They may want to do an extension of the mortgage. So we thought like, let's build a single language model. That's where the power of the NLP comes about. We thought, okay, NLP is highly substantiated with the natural language understanding, because the whole structure of the conversation that you speak is never structured, right? It's a very, very ambiguous. So it was not very easy for us to put the first language model. We were inspired by the famous linguistic Paul Grassin, and we learned how the whole language conversation happens, right? Typically, when two people speak, how the greeting happens and how they actually start talking about a problem, then the resolution happens at one point of a journey. The entire language conversation we mimicked actually during the whole pandemic time, last 1.5 years. We got actually the best of the open source libraries. Of course, the limitation of NLTK, the other libraries that we saw, they have their own limitation. We didn't want to go a third party, get some kind of a SaaS tool. We didn't want to do that because they have a very canned solutions. So we built up the ground up because we wanted to understand what actually our NatWest customer speaks, what that single ontology is, what is that language they speak. When you say ATM blocked, what is the ATM blocked or locked actually? Is it, if you go and search in Wikipedia, the blocked and locked will have a different meaning. So that kind of a conversation, we started building from Ontology. We built the first conversation markers, all from the open source libraries. And the platform now, first, it actually tried to learn the telephonic conversations. And from the telephonic conversation, we could understand the whole intent, the customers, why they call, the reason of a call, why there is a silent in the call, for what predominant reasons. These some of the things we learned from our 80,000 conversations initially as a POC. And then we scaled up that knowledge onto the other chatbots and web chats. And because the knowledge that you learned on one channel, we could replicate it. That's how our, the whole conversation journey, we could do a good breakthrough. We could actually help what are the pandemic topics that is being spoken, because we did the first unsupervised models on the, there were no labels also, because obviously, as I said, right, the conversation journey was not even kicked off before pandemic, but this is a time where no labels were provided, thousands and thousands of conversations. So we chose to do an unsupervised model, which normally even big companies are very scared to do. Unsupervised model, you can disrupt the business. That is where we thought, okay, if you can't do an unsupervised language models, it is of no use. That's how we started. And that in fact gave a very interesting results. And then we could actually understand the whole entity action pairs. We could actually prioritize some of the journeys, right? Some of the journeys like how do you do a mortgage extension? We could see all those kind of a capturing of those conversations once we started tracking these kind of data into our system. So obviously, businesses had a very tough time. Unstructured data was never a very important prioritization. Pandemic made us a prioritization despite our funding challenges in 19 and 20. We could get a special funding just to build this platform. And we went to the big top 5 companies. They declined doing it because this was a very specific use case we had to do from a ground up ontology building. And I would say where we score actually, you can keep outsourcing all these problems, but the ontology or the typical language markers that are so specific to NatWest, you can't actually discount that. You have to build it from ground up. And I would challenge that. That's where all the richness of knowledge comes, and you build it in the form of a knowledge graph. Yeah, a very pleasant journey. We got a very good success rate. Now we are getting a big funding again for next year to make it like an API services, make it available for all our domains and functions. So yes, and we also have published one patent around this whole thing, because this is still a research topic for some of the top 5 companies that we are into this conversation area.
No, lovely, Lata. You bring in the important conversation of domain and domain knowledge, but even more specific to the core of a company and the company's culture, maybe, and the company's interactions with their customers might drive a certain kind of ontology, like you say. So that is core to you, and that is something that you held close to you while you maybe outsource the development. So I think it's a good model to think about. But also beyond the domain, you talked about the language and the structure of language. So there is a science fundamental to it, which also you brought in. So very well framed. So if you look at it from a standpoint of regions, I'm sure you have your operations in multiple regions. And if you're thinking about ontology, or if you're thinking about language, how does that translate?
Yeah, so obviously we have this kind of at the moment, we try to build some of the conversation markers for a specific to European geography, etc. Obviously, mostly we being a UK bank, most of our English-based language. We don't have challenge. Few other local languages other like Polish and other countries, but because there are actually the neural networks models that there is an easy translation of one language to the other language, right? You can understand the context. So where we are now trying to build a language model is not by a linear way, but rather instead of doing it in the form of a pure words to a vector, we do rather words to a vector to form of a neural network space, so that the context can be built beyond the vector length. So our old technology, Gopi, when I'm sure the early phases, they were every language, every sentences would be confined into a particular vector length. What we are trying to do is like not get confined to a vector length, do a deep learning neural network, BERT models, and the other contemporary models like Pegasus model. That's where the language translation and contextualization is, of course, difficult, but at least the content and phrases are not very difficult when we want to transfer. So basically what we give to a business is in the form of okay, this is the top intent, this is the top journey, where your chatbot is not able to handle it. There's a bad handoff goes to our agent, right? So basically, those are the the key words from one language to other language. It has been easy because the natural language, what is available in one language, is easily transportable, because ultimately you're putting in the form of a vector form and the neural network form. And mostly, Gopi, what we do is like we try to do a lot of data training onto the various contextualization. In fact, some of the chatbots, if you see, right, and even the virtual assistants, what has been trained for an English language, we're able to superpose to other European languages because of that translation possibility through the NLU models.
Thanks, Lata. I think there are many challenges there, like you would agree. The context you mentioned, and the context is very difficult to translate, right? If I take an example outside of the banking area, if we looked at the tech space, there are examples which are given based on pizza slices. And if we have to translate that into an Indian context, whether we retain pizza or whether we go with a different approach. So that's in the edtech space. There are also associated with that, not just the language, but the infographics. So there remain challenges in general, but I'm sure Raj has opinions and thoughts on what is the ground reality. Obviously, it's not going to be a perfect solution, but there are application areas which would be sweet spots where we should first look at using NLP. And of course, banking is one. There is significant call volume potentially, and also there is decisioning maybe around loans, and there is an AI application there, but separate from NLP. So we'll keep that aside. Raj, what are your thoughts, and which are the industries which you have seen are the first to not only adopt, but are the right ones to pick up conversational AI?
In terms of the industries, I mean, I think the applicability is mostly, first of all, in the area of customer service or customer experience. There is also applicability and a lot of interest in employee experiences, basically in terms of automating support requests from employees for different functions within the company. And now we're starting to see some interest in supplier experiences or partner experiences. But in terms of industries, when you think about customer experiences being the primary use case, whether it's on voice or on digital channels, the industries that have large consumer bases, like banking, insurance, telecom, travel, healthcare, seem to be the primary industries that are adopting conversational AI. And we also see some manufacturing companies. We have a lot of manufacturing customers who are adopting conversational AI. There are B2B use cases, which are very high value use cases around quoting, around order status, order management, account management, that are providing a lot of value, basically, as well. In terms of how they're adopting it, I think what Dr. Iyer has talked about here is where there's an internal research project which involved creating your own neural networks and being able to use your own data to be able to do that. I don't think most companies are doing that. Most companies are trying to look for a framework or a platform where they can take their data and their ontology and be able to describe it using that framework or platform. And in fact, what we profess is there is no one way of doing NLP. I think the euphoria around machine learning and neural networks and vector models has, slanted this in that direction. When we started building our NLP capabilities about 7 years ago, we looked at what are the different methodologies by which you can do NLP, and 3 of them came to bear. One is the modern day neural networks, basically, and you build a pipeline of algorithms and you do some annotation or labeling, and tune the network, and you provide some parameters to be able to make the network act more liberal or more restrictive depending on what you want to do. And everybody does that. I mean, pretty much every provider and every customer wants to do that, and they do that. And we provide an engine to do that as well, which can be flexible. But two other important learnings that we had was the second way of doing NLP is more on the language itself, the semantics of the semantic language model itself. So understanding intent is based on how a sentence is constructed in a particular language, basically, and the placement of verbs and nouns, and removing noise words, and being able to do other types of things with those collection of sentences to understand the primary intent and to extract out the entities. We have found that that approach, which is not a predictive approach, which is a deterministic approach, has actually provided a lot of benefit to a lot of our customers. And you could include a library of synonyms and concepts and patterns which go along with the language, because a language is a defined set of data, essentially. And there is a way a language works. So we have a semantic model called a fundamental meaning engine, which looks at the language itself. And the third one is a knowledge graph, which is based on an ontology, which Dr. Iyer also talked about, which brings in the domain specificity to being able to predict an intent, where the terms in the sentence that comes in as an input are evaluated, and you go through the ontology to, you go through the knowledge graph to be able to traverse it in a certain way to come to a collection of possible intents, and then you use machine learning at that point or a semantic model at that point to disambiguate between those intents. So what we have done is a little different from the big five that was mentioned earlier, or the rest of the players, in that every utterance goes to all three engines and we get a score back. And then we built an algorithm that resolves between the scores, called a ranking and resolver algorithm, which enables us to be able to build these assistants with less data, but provide higher accuracy, which is ultimately the goal that any company has, basically. So I would submit here that doing NLP is not necessarily a one-trick pony. There are multiple ways to do it, and if you can manage those different ways of doing it well, you'll get the optimal result. And the companies that we deal with, we have over 100 Fortune 500 companies using our platform for very high volume use cases, running into, in some cases, hundreds of millions of interactions that we try to automate. That capability around NLP is, I believe, the appropriate thing to provide to somebody trying to solve that problem.
Yeah. So Raj, I think you're in an environment also where there is a lot of open source information available and open source code. I guess the value that you bring is, again, having worked with many customers, you have insights which nobody else would be able to bring to the table. Is that a fair statement?
Well, we are not a services company to bring insights to the table. Okay. We are a platform company that where we use open source, but we build a platform that makes it easy for enterprises of any type, a large bank, a large insurance company, a large telco, to be able to achieve their ultimate goal of automation, basically in the easiest way possible.
Okay.
So yes, we learn from, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that you mentioned ontology and language semantics. That is learning which you put into the platform itself.
Yes, language semantics is from the language. I mean, it's not domain specific. We have domain specific models for certain industries that we build on top of the knowledge graph and ontology. But most importantly, I think being able to provide a framework or a platform that most companies are not going to be able to invest in, regardless of what open source is out there, basically, and being able to help them achieve their goals, in a quick manner is what we do, essentially.
Thanks, Raj. And as we bring you up, Kayzad, if you can give your thoughts on in an area like life insurance. I'm not sure of everyone, but there will be people who want to actually speak to a person, a real life person. And in this age of conversational AI, and you are going to be championing that, how do you resolve this, and where do you bring in people, and where do you bring in conversational AI?
Yeah, so thanks, Gopi. Very interesting, listening to Dr. Iyer and to Raj. And, I basically come from the demand side of things because I actually head service and operations for Bajaj Allianz Life, which is India's 5th largest private life insurer. We insure about 30 million lives, spread across the subcontinent. So obviously, one of the things that strikes me always when I, talk on these forums is the fact that, India has many countries in one nation. And so therefore, semantics is never going to be an easy job for any service provider. And, typically insurance, it is extremely jargon prone. And unfortunately, because this is a very heavily regulated industry, the use of this jargon is mandated. So, for example, let me give a simple example. While we are all educated and, urban bred and, born, a customer sitting in rural India does not understand the word premium, which is basically, the consideration he has to pay to keep his policy active. So he will think of it as an EMI. He will think of it as an installment. He will think of it as a kisht in Hindi. So, there are so many words for the same terminology that it's very difficult to, really standardize stuff in this country. That being said, as a champion of this topic, the real use case for this came out in the last 15 months. When we actually shut down and we are largely and heavily outsourced to third-party operators. And those guys actually, learned a life lesson through the lockdown when people were not able to access, their premises. So that is when, because we were on this journey for the past couple of years, our, NLP-based bots, both voice as well as chat, really kicked in. And what we found, and, this is very interesting, that, about 3 or 4 years ago, I was actually lecturing in a forum where I talked about an Accenture research where it said that 10 years down the line, 70% of all conversations, human conversations, will be with bots. A surprise, just 3 years later, you had a situation where people were not able to access customers. Retail outlets were shut, call centers were shut. And what really saved the day at that point in time was, outbound bot calling, talking to customers in English and Hinglish and Hindi. Obviously, vernacularization is definitely going to be a challenge in this country, considering the number of dialects and the accents. However, I'll be quite honest. This is really catching up really quickly, because what we see, for example, is that in our WhatsApp bot, for example, what we launched WhatsApp about 15 months ago, just before the lockdown. We've already got about 2 million users. And what is interesting is that every failed occurrence is actually adding to our directory in terms of making sure that we understand what the customer is trying to say, and using NLP to provide a solution. However, we are not leaving customers to the mercy of a bot. What we are doing is assisted service, where every failed occurrence or every time a bot gets stuck, because it's not part of the scripted dictionary, we actually offer human assistance. So if for whatever reason a customer is speaking to my voice bot, and the bot is not able to understand it, auto transfers to a human being in the backend. Similarly, even in my WhatsApp, if for whatever reason we have a failed occurrence, the chat agent immediately gets into the conversation and makes sure that the customer doesn't abandon the conversation. And let me tell you, the biggest death knell for any automated servicing is failure during that journey, because then the customer believes that it doesn't work and he will seek out human assistance. So the faster you digitize the entire process and humanize it. Okay, so how do you bring a human touch to the entire process is the key to actually championing this journey for service-based organizations like ours. And let me give you a simple example. Okay, when we launched WhatsApp, we had about 15% failed occurrences, which has now gone down to just 6%, because we've been learning so fast that every time we've looked at a failure point, we've actually gone back to NLP to understand what the customer said, what he meant, and what could be a probable answer to that. And we've been providing that, and we've seen success, right? I mean, we don't need the human being for 15%. It's down to 6%. Similarly, a customer who basically needs a callback, today it's not an expensive agent who's trying to dial his number multiple times. It's a bot that dials him out. And we know what the customer is going to ask us, because he does leave some kind of message, which tells us that a bot is very easily going to be able to handle that kind of query. So all in all, I think these are good days for NLP. These are good days for automated solutions. And our customers, irrespective of socioeconomic strata, are more and more comfortable with, dealing with a machine that tends to understand them.
Thanks, Kayzad. It's unfortunate that we have only 30 minutes and we are actually at the end of that time. Good conversations seem to pass very quickly. But really wonderful listening to all of you. And even though it might not be readily apparent, there were different perspectives here. I heard Lata talk about the language of the business and bringing the core in and not being able to outsource the core. And I think that has tremendous sense as we look at leveraging NLP. And I can tell you, Lata, that having spent enough time in GE, the language that we spoke even within the organization, leave alone with the customers, like CTQ, it would be understood, even though it would not be, there is no dictionary of all the 3-letter acronyms, but it would be understood within the business. So there is that aspect, but then maybe the way you start your interactions and proceed with the interactions, make the customers also respond in a certain way. And that is part of your still language and ontology. So thanks for bringing that in. And Raj made it clear that when there is a large customer base, the ability to service that customer with their product would be accelerated. And I think that's an important point, that if you're providing premium services to a few customers, that's very different than providing an important service to a large customer base. And you can definitely leverage models and platforms such as Raj's. We talked also about the semantic model and the fact that there are aspects of this which are general and can be brought to bear across industries. Of course, Kayzad, you talked about the jargon and the variation, even in small distances in a country like India, and we all know that cultural contexts change dramatically, and the same sentence, exact same sentence, said in different intonations will have quite different meanings potentially. Of course, maybe in applying for a life insurance, it might not show up in that jargon sense, but it's a tough area. But you said that it is the right time for NLP, so that's very encouraging for all the players there and those who are looking to adopt. But I love the way, and I would like to end with it, is that it is one thing to talk to a machine who you think understands, but it is another thing to be able to humanize that experience by bringing that interaction where required. It is going to be a phygital world, and I think you all brought out various perspectives on how to make a success out of it, be it if you are a provider or be it if you are a consumer of NLP and conversational AI services. But most importantly, all of you have come across as caring for what actually your customer wants. And that is going to be the fundamental of how this will evolve. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Gopi, and all our speakers. That was quite a riveting session on how conversational AI is helping every industry differently.